What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This is episode number 287. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources. I'm in Las Vegas. The other guy, he's in Colorado. He should still be here playing basketball with me, but he had to go home and work. Luis, how was your trip home?
My trip home was good. I got sick after the GP, so I didn't even go to work today. But other than that, things are good.
Well, thanks for being a trooper and coming on to do the show. I know you're not feeling super well, but we certainly appreciate it that you're such a tough guy and you're going to come on and do the show.
Something like that.
Yeah, I saw that you did the Standard Super League last night as well. You're pushing a little hard here, buddy. Don't kill yourself now.
Yeah, I think I'll survive.
All right. As with every week, Limited Resources is brought to you by channelfireball.com. Now, we just got done with GP Vegas, but there's another one on the horizon that Channel Fireball is in fact hosting. It's GP Copenhagen. So this one's a little further away for our stateside listeners.
Yeah, and you can check it out at gpcopenhagen.com. As of this recording, there's 791 seats left, so I wouldn't want anyone to miss out. And, you know, while we mentioned GP Vegas, I swear this is the last time you hear about it because, you know, we've been kind of opening the show with it for months. But honestly, I just want to thank everyone who came out to it. I think the event went really, really well. I know I had a great time. A lot of people I talked to had a great time. There were 15,000 people there or something like that because the GP was just almost a backdrop to the whole weekend. And, you know, it was just awesome seeing that many people there enjoying just all the different aspects of Magic.
Yeah, you know, from my perspective on coverage, I did a 4-day coverage gig there. I was Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday in the booth. And the first 2 days we were doing outside content, getting interviews, checking out cool attractions and stuff that people were doing. And it was one of the most memorable tournaments I've ever covered quite easily. It had a convention-like feel, and I have to say I'm kind of hoping that we start running these things over again. Also, to any of you listeners that came up and said hi during the course of the 4-day event, thank you. It was awesome. I'm used to that at the GP level where people will come up and say hey, but man, this one was a totally different thing. It just had a completely different feel to it, and I talked to so many people, and it was really cool to get a chance to see so many of you face to face. And I just wanted to say thanks for coming up and saying thanks for the show and stuff like that. It really means a lot.
It definitely does. Every time someone comes up and talks to me about LR, it makes me happier that I'm doing the show. So.
Yeah, me too. I'm the same way. It's just that feedback is really cool, and we appreciate it. Also, you know, a lot of people did come up and say, yeah, you guys kept saying to go to the GP on the show. So I came out to the GP and they're
here,
like,
what now?
thanks. Yeah. Like, is this it? And also we're not going to go super in depth on it, but I did want to say congrats, Luis, on a really nice run at the GP. You finished with only 2 losses on the whole weekend, which was fantastic.
Yeah, I went 13-2, went 8-1 on day 1 and 5-1 on day 2. It's funny. I'll be relating a little bit, you know, my tournament experience when we talk about the different decks we're going to draft. But it is funny that I ended up doing some things in the tournament that I kind of advised against, but for good reason. I mean, we talked about like the 11 biggest traps in Limited last week, and I think one of the key takeaways of any show really is that when we talk about rules, we do it for simplicity's sake, and because 90% of the time it's, you know, one way or the other.
Right.
One of the things that comes with greater knowledge of Limited is knowing when to break those rules, and I did fall into that camp.
Yeah, but it was still cool, and I was really proud that you had such a good run. Unfortunately, with so many players in each of the GPs in Vegas, a 13-2 record was not good enough for top 8. In fact, it wasn't good enough for top 16 in this case, which is just, you know, kind of mind-boggling, but that's just the structure of these tournaments.
Yeah, I'm not actually, you know, disappointed or bitter at all about it. I mean, I don't think I should be. I had a good finish and I had a good record, and it was a great tournament.
Good. Also, if you want to support the show, you can do so directly via the Patreon. That's patreon.com/limitedresources. There's some cool bonuses for signing up there. And one of them is that you get to ask questions. And I've got a Patreon question of the week here from Adam. He says, what's your opinion on talking to your opponent during the game? He says he tends to treat games at an F&M almost like playtesting, so he's really talkative before, during, and after the games about his strategy and tactics. He says, I think at worst I give up some percentage of equity by frequently openly voicing my thought process. If my opponent doesn't respond to my game chatter, I usually just clam up. He doesn't want to feel like he's ruining it for his opponent. He says, do you think that I'm slowing down my progress by being so informal and approaching most matches this way? What do you think about that, Luis?
It's interesting. I tend not to talk to my opponents when I play matches, not because I think there's like a game disadvantage by doing so. It's just I don't want to annoy my opponents, especially since, you've watched a lot of my matches. I spend a lot of my time sitting there waiting for my opponents to do things just because I tend to play pretty fast.
Yeah, you play really quickly.
I don't want to annoy them by talking to them while they're trying to think.
We actually made that joke this weekend on coverage because we had a camera that was a wide shot of both of the players, and every time we came to it, you were looking at the other match. you had checked out at some point, and you were just like, "Yeah, let me know when you're done." Well, it was pretty funny.
Yeah, when we play team events, I tend to sit in the middle so I can watch both other matches. But
yeah, because you're like an absurd multitasker, though. I don't know if people realize that like when we're in the booth doing coverage, you're usually like checking the Twitch chat alongside a bunch of other stuff at the same exact time.
I like keeping myself occupied, but as such, I don't want to, I feel like I don't want to disrespect my opponent and talk to them. Not that I'm saying it's disrespectful to talk to your opponent. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying I don't want to like chatter at my opponent because the level of chatter I could sustain, I feel like would annoy some of my opponents and maybe throw them off their game. And I actually don't want that. But, this is one of those like kind of human interaction things where you kind of have to just base it opponent by opponent. I've had some pretty chatty matches because I feel like my opponent's into it, or they kind of lead with it. And I've had matches that are played in like stone silence, and I don't think that it's wrong to talk during a tournament. I just tend not to because if my opponent wants to talk, they can talk, and that's great. But if they don't want to, I don't want to like put the burden on them by talking.
Why don't you extend this courtesy to me when we're hanging out?
Well, you literally want me to talk because this is a podcast.
No, when we're hanging out, not on the podcast.
Well,
I never feel like I'm so loved like your opponents.
Yeah.
But do you feel like he's giving up something by doing the chatter, especially if he's talking specifically about like, well, if I attack with this and you have this and that could be bad, do you think he's giving up something there?
Yeah, I think you probably are. When you talk to your opponent, if you're talking about the game, unless you're trying to run some kind of mind games on them, which honestly I would think to some degree that this reminds me of. And I'm going to use this as a segue into one of the times I did talk to my opponents for a very funny manner. This was at Grand Prix Portland, the team Grand Prix. I'm playing against Joe Demestrio, and I don't feel bad calling him out because he's posted about it on Facebook a number of times. But I have no cards in my hand. I draw for my turn, this is a game one. I have a bunch of cards in my hand. I leave 5 mana untapped and don't replay a creature that got bounced. And he untaps and he's thinking, and I just tell him like, well, I've got Aether Spouts. And he's like, what the hell? And then he just like tanks, then attacks with everything, and I cast Aether Spouts. And
that's great.
I honestly can't say why I did that, but I just felt like getting value because if he plays around it by not attacking, then he might think. The problem is I had a Jace's Ingenuity in my hand, which costs also 3 blue. They have the exact same cost.
So you were in one of those spots where it was kind of he was damned if he did, damned if he didn't.
And I knew that if he played around it by not attacking, then I cast Ingenuity, it would just tilt him, and he would think I didn't have the Aether Spouts, then next turn I'd get him. And if he attacked into it and I cast it after telling him I had it, it would tilt him. So
that's fantastic. That's just too good.
But anyway, I feel like we've gone a little far afield. In general, I would recommend to this listener that save the talk for after the tournament or after the game. I think that's actually a good time to break down games. In general, I personally would kind of recommend against doing that, but you do you.
Yeah, for me, I tend to agree with Luis on it. I mean, the funny part is coming from my poker background, when I started playing Magic, I mean, in poker, you don't say anything. I mean, ideally, and you also don't show anything. You'll see people wearing all the sunglasses and all that kind of crap too, just to try to hide it. And in Magic, I remember just being blown away when I started playing at local tournaments, how vocal and people just showed their emotions so openly. They'd just be like, ugh, they like draw their card needing a land and say, ugh, or, another land or whatever. And it was just like, I remember thinking at the beginning, oh, this guy's just totally trying to level me or whatever. Nope. They were always just telling the stone truth. And I'm just like, I guess I just get all this free information. It is funny though, to address Adam's question directly though, is that I do find when I verbally speak out the things that I'm thinking, it actually does help me organize my thoughts, which I'm really not happy with because I'd rather just do it in my head. And I don't talk during games. I don't talk at all. if I can help it. But it is funny that a few times when I was like messing around with my friends or in a more casual setting, I've talked it through like, yeah, well, you could easily have this. Would you have that? Yeah, you probably do. I'm going to play around it. And I just like say these things. And I remember thinking like, actually, that's kind of organized my thoughts a little better than when I do it, just in my own head, which is, like I said, it's something I need to work on, is to get better at that, at just keeping it in my head. But yeah, I agree. Save it for after, but then go nuts. Okay, so let's do a Crack-A-Pack, Luis. Tyler came up to me at GP Vegas, and he handed me a pack of Modern Masters 2015 and said, crack away, my friend. And so we're going to do that. Thank you, Tyler, for that. So disappointing. Doesn't feel as cool. Doesn't smell as good.
Well, these cards are printed differently than normal cards, so.
I suppose so. Also, they are thankfully recyclable, this packaging, so I like that. All right, first up, Nameless Inversion. Good start.
Yeah, we started strong. Nameless Inversion is one of the cards I like taking early because it not only is very powerful, it also is a great synergy card. It's one of the rare cards that, because it's a shapeshifter, because it's like a tribal shapeshifter, it counts as spirit, it counts as, arcane, it counts as an elemental, and it's just a good spell. So it can go in almost any deck you draft and is a very important part of some of them. So yeah, this is a great first pick. It's one of the better commons to first pick.
Yeah, for sure. I'm super happy to see it. Our next one's actually quite good as well. It's Sunlance. That's white sorcery, deals 3 damage to a non-white creature. I like Nameless Inversion better, but I haven't cut a Sunlance from a white deck yet.
I cut 2 in my green-white deck, but that's just because the deck was too good. But
yeah, because your deck was off. Yeah. We'll talk about that deck in a little while.
But Sunlance is also a fine first pick. I would rather first pick Nameless Inversion. I feel like it's a little bit more powerful and a little bit more integral to the decks you draft. But Sunlance is a great card too. I basically wouldn't be that unhappy about first picking a Sunlance, even though this is a format where, yeah, like most formats, if you first pick a common, you're not quite as happy as if you first pick something with a higher rarity symbol.
Yeah, exactly. Next is Sickle Ripper, which is the 2/1 Wither for 1 and a black. And, this one's a nice one because it's the exact same converted mana cost as Nameless Inversion and way worse.
Yeah, makes it an easy decision to pass on.
Yeah. Next is Wings of Velis Vel. I had an opponent cast this on me on 2 separate occasions on Magic Online last night, actually while I was streaming. And,
that's pretty lucky.
I felt blessed. This card doesn't do that much. I 2-for-1 my opponent both times. And, I'm definitely not even considering this. I'm not even considering playing it, let alone picking it here.
So yeah, what this does is just makes a creature into a 4/4 flying creature of all creature types for 1 and a blue at instant. Yeah. And it's just I don't think it's a playable card. I've never seen a deck where I thought this was a card you should add to your deck.
Mighty Leap.
So 1 and a white instant, give a creature +2/+2 in flying. The joke here is that you Mighty Leap a double striker. That is still not quite good enough, even in a deck with a bunch of double strikers. I don't really like this card. So I wouldn't really be a fan of taking it.
Yeah, me too. Dusk Hunter Bat, same thing. Again, it's another 1 and a black creature. This one's a 1/1 flyer with Bloodthirst 1. It's okay, but it's just Nameless Inversion is so much higher above any of these that it's just not really worth considering. Brute Force, that's the red Giant Growth. It's red instant. Target creature goes +3/+3 until end of turn. Is this one better or worse than Mighty Leap? I know that we're not considering picking this, but just to compare the two.
In general, I like Brute Force more. I think it does more for less mana.
Okay. Plummet, the only green removal spell, but we're not taking it here. Did you see people main decking Plummets in either sealed or draft at the GP?
I don't think you should ever main deck it in draft, and I actually don't like main decking in sealed. I think it's passable, but I don't love doing so. I don't know. This isn't quite a flyer heavy as flyer a heavy format as some of the other ones. So I think it's a great sideboard card. I like having these in my sideboard, but in general, I don't love it.
Yeah, a couple of people asked me if they should be a main decking Plummet, and I told them no. Rune Servitor is a 2/2 for 2 colorless, and when it dies, each player draws a card. Filler, right? I mean, you play it occasionally, but
it's slightly above filler in that you play it when you really want an artifact or a 2-drop or both. So like the decks that really want it, like the Convoke deck or the Affinity deck, I don't mind this card at all. But in general, it's not a card you should just like randomly put in your deck and be happy about.
Right. Next up is same cost. It's Sphere of the Suns.
Sphere of the Suns is an artifact that comes to play tapped with 3 counters, and you can tap and remove a counter and add any color mana to your pool, which It's actually not as good in the 5-color deck as you might think, just because that deck's mana intensive and you want to tap your mana multiple times. So I actually don't like playing this in that deck. I think it is a good card in the Affinity deck, but in general, Sphere of the Suns is not a card I prioritize.
Yeah, it's funny. It has a lot of competition in this format. A lot of 2-mana ways to get another color and ramp your mana. Of course, there's also Matka Riders and Tribal Flames, which just does not contribute to, it's only the Sunburst cards or just the other colored spells that it works with. So that's a little bit of a knock as well, especially when there is Rampant Growth and even Colorless Wayfarer's Bauble that do help you cast other color spells and work with the domain cards. So yeah, I think Sphere is just sort of low on the rung there. Next up is Remand.
I like Remand. I think in general, Remand is a pretty strong card. It's instant for 1 and a blue. Counterspell, return it to the owner's hand and draw a card. So,
yeah.
For those who haven't played with it, this card was one of the best cards in the format and constructed. In Limited, basically what it does is you get to trade 2 mana for your opponent's 3 to 7 mana, depending on what you cast Remand on. I think it's a good card if you're base blue. It's not a card that's better than Nameless Inversion or Sunlance. So it's a card I like having in my deck, but not a card I really want to take too early.
Yeah, one of the things to keep in mind with Remand as well is that it generally plays much better if your deck's a little more assertive. If you can get yourself out to a lead or be applying pressure in some level, Remand is a lot better. It's just not a permanent solution over the course of a grindy long game. Not that it doesn't hold its own. It replaces itself and it's a tempo hit. So, it's not like it's going to be a liability. It's just not going to be an answer. It basically temporarily keeps them off of whatever threat they're doing. And if you can capitalize on that temporary nature, the card goes up in value a lot. Mutagenic Growth is the next one. That's the +2/+2 until end of turn instant for a green Phyrexian mana. So it can be free. I don't know how extra great that is here, though.
It's a fine card. It's a card that mostly lives in my sideboard, but because creature combat between similar-sized creatures is not a big feature of this format, but it's better when you have double-striking creatures, and it's an okay sideboard card against burn spells. So I certainly wouldn't be looking to take it here.
No. All right. Well, so right now you and I are both on Nameless Inversion, correct?
Yeah.
I know I am. We got a contender, maybe. Palaka Worm.
Palaka. This is a green for a 7/7. So that doesn't sound great, but when it comes to play, you gain 7 life, and when it dies, you draw a card. So yeah, this is a card. This is a card that's like a basis of the ramp deck, just because this is one of the rewards you get for ramping up to 7 ahead of schedule.
Right.
That being said, it costs triple green and 7, so there's just the number of decks that can play it are not as nearly as big as Sunlance or Nameless Inversion. So I would still take the Nameless Inversion.
Yeah, I would too, just for openness purposes. But man, and Palaka Worm also has Trample. It's unreal how good this card is at uncommon.
I don't even know if I've ever attacked with it. So,
oh come on, you've attacked with it. Our foil is a Stoic Rebuttal. So that's the counterspell. 1 blue. It's basically cancel, but if you've got Metalcraft, it's straight up counterspell.
So, if you ever want to hear one of the worst conversations in the world, you could ask me or Paulo,
I know I do.
or Owen about which one we should have played in our blue-black control deck, Stoic Rebuttal or Cancel, when we had a total of 3 artifacts in the entire deck, which were all Ratchet Bombs, which are just an artifact that sacrifices itself. We had this conversation for hours before Worlds 2010, and it was just the worst conversation I've ever been a part of. So every time I see Stoic Rebuttal, I just think of not this again.
Oh, we got a shiny one here for you, buddy.
As a card, I actually like this card. I drafted a deck today that was just like red-blue control with 2 Stoic Rebuttal and 4 repeals, and I had a pretty good time playing that deck. I'm not saying you should snap off Stoic Rebuttal, though.
Yeah. This is also interesting to contrast with the Remand that we talked about a little while ago. If you are finding yourself in that grindy game where, maybe somebody's going to try to resolve a big threat or a big bomb that you're going to have a hard time dealing with, this can be an answer to that. It's a much more permanent solution. Our rare is Thunderblust.
So that one is not bad. It's 2 red. So it's 5 mana, 3 of which are red for a 7/2 haste. It's an elemental, and then when it dies, it just persists. So it comes back into play with a -1/-1 counter, and as long as it has a counter, it does trample. So this is kind of like play this, smash, trade for their 2/2, which isn't great, but then you end up with a 6/1 trample. So it frequently 2-for-1s your opponent, sometimes even hits them for 7 the turn it comes out, and it's a pretty big threat.
Yeah, it's really scary. It's a nice curve topper if you're heavy red, but that kind of there lies the rub, right? It's too red to cast this thing. So, there's basically only one way to go if you're going to play a Thunderblast, and that's with red as your base color. Your heavy red decks will play a Thunderblast quite happily, maybe even multiples. But outside of that, the 5-color deck doesn't play this thing. If you're, let's say you're playing, I don't know, another deck that uses some red cards but isn't primarily red, Thunderblast loses a lot of its luster because the longer the game goes, the worse it gets. And I feel like while the power level is certainly here to, be in the same ballpark as like a Nameless Inversion or a Palaka Worm or something like that, I think it's below enough. And then the fact that it's triple red means that I'm not really considering Thunderblast out of this pack. I think I would still just take the Nameless Inversion.
Completely agree. If I knew I was going to end up with 3 Smoke Breeders, sure, I would Thunderblast, but Nameless Inversion goes in like 3 or 4 different good decks.
Yeah, it is an elemental. Okay, so that's going to do it for our Crack-a-Pack. But let's get into this. So we are going to talk about the top 5 draft archetypes for Modern Masters 2015. Now, we mentioned before when we did our set primer show that we didn't want to do a whole bunch of episodes and a whole bunch of extra stuff because we kind of know that Modern Masters is going to come and go. And that you're going to get a chance to draft it, once or twice at your local store if you're lucky, and then it's going to be gone. But we did think that it was worth it since it is out on Magic Online at the time, and it is still floating around in local stores while supplies last or whatever, that we would take one show now that Luis and I have had a chance to really play more drafts with it and even, get our hands on the cards. I did a whole weekend of coverage on it. I did some drafts there. I've done some Magic Online. Luis played an entire GP. Start to finish. And like we said earlier, he went 13-2 in the format. And I think both of us feel like we have a much better grasp on what's going on with the cards and how the format works. So we thought we'd take a show here to discuss the top 5 draft archetypes that we've discovered to try to get you ready so that if you are planning on playing in one, on the weekend at your local shop, or if you're going to grind some on Magic Online, you'll have an idea of what to go for.
Additionally, I actually did a straw poll today to decide what videos to record since, like I said, I was home from work. And Modern Masters Draft overwhelmingly beat the next highest contender. So, I think people want to think about the format and see the format. I do believe that having one more show on that, especially since it's kind of like putting a bell end on the thing we started, which was talking about the different archetypes, actually seeing which ones are good. So I would not want to leave the viewers with, or I guess listeners without, at what we've gotten out of the format, since I feel like, I think we both know a lot more about the format than we did the first time.
Yeah, I think so too. All right. So let's jump in. Starting with number 5, we've got Black, White Spirits. And this was one of the archetypes that really stood out, right? Even just looking at the card image gallery when they first came out with the cards, it was apparent that this Spirits deck was going to be one of the most archetypical, synergistic type decks that you could draft. And it turns out it's also quite good. Right.
And one of the reasons this is one of the decks that stands out is it's one of the most linear decks. It's one of the decks that, and I'm going to explain this most of the times I mentioned it, but how linear a deck is just like such a core concept to Limited. And what that means is the cards in this deck don't work that well with other cards outside of their group, and they work very well with the cards inside the group. So
right.
Spirits is one of the more linear decks because the cards in it, other people won't want them for the most part, and they're very good with each other, and again, not good outside of that. And Spirits has so many cards like that that's what tends to give the really good decks and the decks that sometimes really don't get there. So I think Spirits definitely falls into that category, and it's one of the decks I have not minded drafting.
Now, what are the sort of headlining features of this deck? What are the things that come to mind when you think of how this deck drafts and plays?
So I think the useful way to look at these archetypes is first look at how you get into them. Like, how do you end up in one of these decks? And then look at what's important in the deck.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Because one of the reasons I, like Spirits or our next deck, Affinity, less than some of the decks lower on the list that are better, is that it's not that easy for me to get into these decks because I'm not taking a card like Scuttling Death third pick. It's just that would make me, that I don't think that's a good idea. Same with like, Mirror Enforcer or whatever. So one of the ways to get into spirits is do something like the pack we just opened, which is Nameless Inversion. Nameless Inversion is the best card you can have for spirits that isn't like, a great rare. Because Nameless Inversion is a 2-drop spirit, which you can just keep getting back with Thief of Hope, Moonlit Strider, or Scuttling Death. And that just means that if you have 2 Nameless Inversions, you just have a deck where, 6 of your creatures draw you a 3 damage removal when they die. And
which is insane.
That's very good. So the difference between a spirit deck with Nameless Inversion and one without is very big. So there are not that many ways for me to get into this deck that don't involve Nameless Inversion. Another way to get into this deck is Spectral Procession. This is not a card we had access to when Spirits were first drafted. And for white, getting 3/1 on flying Spirits makes the card Devouring Greed just absurd.
Right.
Go ahead,
read it. Yeah.
Devouring Greed is 2 black sorcery, sack any number of spirits, drain your opponent for 2 for every spirit you sacrificed.
I remember talking with you. I had also talked with Ben Stark about it independently before the GP, and both of you guys, especially him, he was so high on Devouring Greed in that deck. He just said it's just that it just completely ends the game, right? Like it often does 10 or 12 in one hit. Like, name a magic card that you pay 4 mana and do 10 damage to your opponent. Like that just doesn't exist. So I can see why.
Right, and Devouring Greed is a card I've frequently passed last pick. You can get with 3 cards left in the pack. That's not that hard to do. Usually only one person at the table wants that card. So the ways to get into spirits, like I said, are Nameless Inversion at common, Spectral Procession uncommon, and then another key card that I found to be super important to the deck is Restless Apparition. That's 3 black-white hybrid mana for a 2/2 spirit. You can pay 3 black-white hybrid mana to give it +3/+3 until end of turn, and it has Persist. This card, if you just have only swamps and plains in your deck, this card is insane.
Yeah, it's great. We saw it do a ton of work at the GP too. It's really difficult to deal with also because of the Persist.
Right, it's a 5 to 8 power attacker that comes back for a second time when it dies first. And for only 3 mana. You can just play it on turn 3, trade for their 2/2, and you're already up a card, and the 1/1 threat is really a 4/4 or a 7/7. So that's another reason, like another incentive to draft this deck. What kind of makes all the best spirits deck work is the Soul Shift chain. This is, again, Thief of Hope, Moonlit Strider, and Scuttling Death. They all bring back a cheaper spirit when they die. So you kind of, the bottom of the chain is more important than the top, because if you draw 2 Scuttling Deaths, that's pretty bad. But if you draw 1 Scuttling Death and 1 cheaper card, that's pretty good.
Okay.
So you want like a curve of spirits. You want to kind of try to even it out with a slight emphasis on the bottom. You also want, even besides Nameless Inversion, which is, of course, the most important card, Kami of Ancient Law is a very good one. That's 1 and a white for a 2/2, and you sack it to kill an enchantment. But the key difference is this not only triggers your Thief of Hope when you cast it, you can bring it back with any of your Soul Shift chain. The disaster scenario is having one of your Soul Shift creatures die without anything to get back.
That's what you're trying to avoid. And even though the guy's only a 2/2, Kami of Ancient Law is only a 2/2 that has an ability that occasionally comes up, you have to be getting value.
Right. This deck kind of lives and dies on value. And yeah, that sounds awesome. But the downside of this deck is that your cards tend to be a little more expensive than other people's cards. And you're not doing anything all that powerful. Like, yes, your cards all draw cards, but unless you're getting back inversions, a lot of the time, a 3-mana 2/2 that when it dies draws a 2-mana 2/2 is not, I mean, that's good, but it's not anything comparable to what some of the other decks in the format could do. So I think that Spirits is a good deck if you get Devouring Greed and Nameless Inversion and a bunch of Spirits. I think it's one of the decks, though, that I don't end up in all that often because I need a specific reason to be there. Because it is one of those linear decks that, you can get a pack with Spirits that has 2 black cards and 2 white cards and has 0 cards that you really want.
Right. Another feature of the deck is that black and white both have very solid removal available to them across the chain. One thing that I look for in decks like this is, does the removal scale with what the deck's trying to do? For example, if I'm a really hardcore red aggressive deck, right, I don't really need my removal to go up to to be able to kill a 5/5 or a 6/6 because my plan is to kill their blockers and have them dead before those type of cards can come down. But in a deck like this Black-White Spirits deck, it isn't actually that fast, right? It has these kind of weird combo finishes with Waxbane Baku tapping down a team and getting in a whole bunch of random spirits for a bunch of damage, or, pecking away with a Thief of Hope, the trigger from a Thief of Hope, and then eventually just firing off a Devouring Greed and completely killing them. But that can take a while. That isn't the kind of thing where you just curve out and kill somebody, especially if you start soul shifting back things. It ends up being quite grindy. So what that means is you do need to have a wide removal suite to be able to deal with some of the decks that come out quickly, but also be able to kill some of the bombs. Somebody plays a Palaka Worm against you, you need to be able to kill that. And your nameless inversions aren't very good at accomplishing that goal. But the good news is you get cards like Arrest, like Spread the Sickness, that can take out basically any threat. And then you also get the cheap stuff that we mentioned before, like the nameless inversions and the Sunlances of the world as well, that will take out those early threats and make sure that you don't get ran over. And I think that, Black and White sits in a very nice place as far as removal goes. You're going to have access to basically the full spectrum.
Yeah, and I actually wanted to mention Waxbane Baku in the removal section because one of the advantages of drafting this deck is that you get Waxbane Baku. It's 2 and a white for a 2/2 that triggers. You put a counter on it whenever you cast a Spirit or Arcane, and you pay 1 to remove X counters to tap X creatures. You get access to a first pick quality card, 6 picks sometimes, because no one else can use the card. And that is one of the advantages of drafting Spirits, is you have an extra basically tier 1 removal spell that you could even soul shift back if you need to. So.
And that is actually completely true, right? There's literally no other deck that actually wants Waxbane Baku outside of this one.
No, I have never drafted a non-spirit based deck that wants Waxbane Baku. It just doesn't do anything.
Right. And that's so huge, right? Like the fact that
it's still just a 2/2.
You know what I mean? It's just such a big deal that's if you're the only Spirits drafter, you get all of them. Right? And it's just a massive deal because it's such an important card for the deck.
Right, you get to first pick your Sunlance or your Arrest or what have you, and you get to fifth pick your Waxbane Baku, which is as good or better than those cards in your deck. So that's one of the payoffs for drafting Spirits.
So from a big picture perspective, Black-White Spirits, how would you say it plays out generally? If you're going to win a game, how does that look?
It highly depends on whether you have Devouring Greed in your deck, because you can draft the deck without Devouring Greed. Like I've drafted a controlling version of the deck that has something like 6 or 7 removal spells, 2 Waxmanes, and a bunch of Soul Shift cards, and there you win by just killing all your opponent's threats. You can even go over the top of the 5-color deck sometimes, but that and the way that wins is just, again, playing Waxmane and either killing or tapping all your opponent's threats before you kill them. If you have Devouring Greed, though, then you're kind of like more focused on the Thief of Hope triggers, because whenever you play a Spirit Arcane, you get to drain them for 1. You get them to around 10, and then you just Devour and Greed them for 1 million.
And that ends up being your late game, basically.
Right. You're looking to end the game around turn 8 or 9 with Devour and Greed. Not super fast, but your cards are all resilient. They shrug off removal to some degree, and you're usually able to stop your opponent from killing you.
Now, Devouring Greed, is there significant risk if you're going down that line? I mean, you have to sack the creatures as an additional cost, right?
Yeah, you don't want to get mana leaked, and if your opponent has Stoic, Rebuttal, or Remand, I guess that's good beats.
Okay, then you just sort of take your medicine there. And
for the most part, you can't do anything about that.
Okay. All right, well, why don't we move on to Affinity, which is the number 4. So this is the, generally speaking, it's a blue-white deck, right? A little heavier on the white.
It's, blue-white, unless your deck's great, in which case sometimes it can be mono-white. Raptor actually drafted a mono-white Affinity deck during the Grand Prix. His deck was so good. But I have not seen a good Affinity deck that doesn't include some amount of white, just because the card Court Homunculus is really important. And then Sunlance is actually the best removal spell for this deck because it costs 1 mana. And this is the deck that most frequently wants to play like 14 to 16 land. So you can definitely get there. So the tricky part for me for Affinity is I don't end up there all that often, because there's basically no card that you can take for Affinity that translates well to other decks besides like Sunlance. So,
right.
Because this is just all on the artifact synergies. It's all on, Frogmite, Mirror Enforcer, like Somber Hoverguard, Court Homunculus, other cheap artifacts, some equipment. But none of these are cards I really want to start with early. So there are basically 2 big ways I go into it. One is I open Cranial Plating, because Cranial Plating is incredibly good. It's 2 mana equipment, you pay 1 to equip, and +1/+0 for each artifact you have. So this card's actually very good in red-white as well, and it's kind of the nuts in Affinity. It's just the best card. So getting early Cranial Plating is actually powerful enough that I go down that route sometimes. Alternately, I start out with, a normal deck, especially a white deck where I picked, like, let's say a Blinding Soul Eater and a Sunlance, and then I get like a 5th pick Darksteel Citadel, 6th pick Frogmite, 7th pick Court Homunculus, 8th pick Court Homunculus, and then, wheel a Mirror Enforcer, and it becomes clear no one else wants to draft the artifacts. And then you can kind of end up there. But what I absolutely would not do is do something like first pick a Mirror Enforcer. First of all, Mirror Enforcer is just mediocre in the deck anyway. It's fine when your deck is good, but for the most part, you should not be just moving in on Affinity. I don't think that's the way to approach this deck because it's so linear, and if you fail, you try to get there and fail, if you end up with 10 artifacts in your deck is just absolutely garbage.
Right. And this you can really see the difference when you look at a few different builds of Affinity, how much better these things become. I was talking with Randy about it, and he drafted Affinity multiple times before the GP went. And, he was telling me some of the key cards for him. And, one of them that popped up for him was Darksteel Citadel. And he says he just won't pass that card if he's playing Affinity.
Oh, absolutely. One of the reasons, and it might be a little counterintuitive to think that this is a key card of the deck, it's that you just want 20 artifacts in your deck, and it's hard to do that without having some of your lands be artifacts. So right. Darksteel Citadel is really, really important.
So how low will you go, right? That, because you were talking about some of the better cards for Affinity. You were talking about the Somber Hover Guards and, the Court Homunculi and stuff like that. But, cranial plating. But you do need critical mass of just artifacts. If you find yourself a bit short, like how deep are you willing to go to get them? A card we mentioned earlier from the Crack-A-Pack was like a Sphere of the Suns, which doesn't do a ton in the deck, but is an artifact.
In order to get to like the 15 to 18 artifact range, and ideally more, you'll play Flare Husk, you'll play Rune Servitor, you'll play Sphere of the Suns, you'll play all these cards because Gust Skimmer is just like an all-star in the deck. Glidhawk Idol is legitimately just one of your best cards. You're just going to play all these cards because if you don't get there, then all your other cards don't do anything. So one of the features of these decks is the good Affinity decks have the only cards in the entire deck are artifacts, lands, and removal spells. That's basically it. Like Somber Hover Guard, counts as well as like, an Affinity enabler or Affinity payoff, but pretty much nothing else. Like this is not a deck where you have a random Kami of the Ancient Law. It's just, there's no reason for that card to exist in your deck if you have a good version.
Excuse me. How does a deck normally play out?
It's just an aggressive deck. It's trying to, make it either ideally with cranial plating, just kill your opponent like by turn 5, which is very doable, or just curve out and have like 2 Mirror Enforcers and a Frogmite and play on turn 4, which is also something you can do. It's you're trying to attack your opponent. Like again, the deck Rafter draft in the GP is one of the best ones I've seen. He was mono white with 5 Sunlands and 4 Court Homunculus.
Whoa! And
he would just do stuff like turn 1 Court Homunculus, turn 2 Court Homunculus, Sunlands for 2-drop, turn 3 attack, play Frogmite, Sunlands another thing, play another Court Homunculus or whatever, play another like random just 2 mana 2/2, and just killed his opponent very quickly. So
wow, that's insane.
This is a beatdown deck. It's definitely not a control deck.
Okay, and if you lose with the deck, what does that look like? Does it look like any other beatdown deck? They kill your first 3 threats or whatever, and then their stuff's bigger than yours?
Well, one of the parts about this deck is that when it loses really hard. If they kill your first 2 threats, sometimes you can't even cast your follow-ups.
They just get stuck in your hand.
You've got Plains Island. Down. Yeah, you've got Plains Island in play, and your hand is like a Mirror Enforcer and a Somber Hover Guard, and they just killed 3 of your cheap creatures in a row.
One of the cards that I had kind of highlighted early was Somber Hover Guard's big brother, Cumulox. But that card's actually kind of plummeted in my list. I don't really even consider it much of a thing for that deck. It just still seems too expensive or slow. Where do you have Cumulox for the blue-white deck?
I don't like it because what this deck is trying to do is, first of all, it's trying to play like 15 lands or 14 or 16 lands. Some definitely less than 17 or 18 because its cards are so cheap. It's also trying to play ideally like 2 to 3 Darksteel Citadels if it can get that many. That doesn't leave a lot of room for colored mana sources, and you want most of them to be plains because Court Homunculus is really important. So a double blue card is actually just not a card I found myself wanting in these decks.
Yeah, that definitely seemed like a major issue too, and it kind of stopped showing up there. So you mentioned Sunlance as a card that could get you into this. You said Blinding Soul Eater is another one that you would take, that you could play potentially in a different deck, but that you might find yourself in Affinity if you see the cards are going. Are there any others? It feels hard to really kind of find your lane with this deck because you want to jump in after you know it's open as opposed to up front because there's no, a concept I've been talking about, to sort of put some substance around this, is the idea of a pivot card, right? A card in this format that you can play in multiple decks. And what are the most important key ones, and this is sort of something that I'm populated in my head as we go through and as I draft more of cards that I know that I can put into multiple decks and I'm going to be happy with. And it's interesting because this one are those the only two? Blinding Soul Eater and Sunlance?
Those are the two most open ones because those are great cards in any white deck, and Soul Eater can actually fit well in like red-black aggro. But Cranial Plating is actually one of the biggest reasons to get into the deck, just because I don't mind taking Cranial Plating early. Again, it fits into the red-white equipment deck, which often bleeds into this deck, and it's just a hugely powerful card. Like, this is a reason to do this, whereas I don't think you want to take early other artifacts with the intention of doing this because you need a payoff, and Cranial Plating is that payoff.
Okay. Deck's pretty sweet. It feels broken when it goes right, especially I've noticed that the truly broken draws come from the Darksteel Citadels. Those are the ones that, they often just act as 2 mana. And I mean, if you've ever played with a land that produces 2 mana before, you'll know that that's just completely busted. And that deck can do some seriously broken stuff.
Yeah, the linear decks tend to be that way. I mean, part of the reason that you're willing to take on the risk of drafting a deck that could just miss and end up fizzling is that the decks are legitimately broken when they work out.
Yeah, it's pretty fun because in normal draft and not Modern Masters draft, we don't usually get decks that can have that high a power level just because they don't make them quite that siloed off. All right, why don't we move on to number 3? Which is red-based aggressive decks. You really think that these are high on the list, huh?
I do, and so I kind of split. We kind of cheated here. We're technically looking at like the top 7 decks, but I think that there's a reason for that. And again, going back to how do you end up in these decks, I kind of group red-white and red-black together because you can often draft such that you can leave yourself open to either of them. So both these are red-based aggressive decks. Though they sometimes can be, heavy in black or heavy in white. I'm not saying red has to be a dominant color. It's not like Affinity where I think white is just going to be the dominant color there. Mm-hmm. But these are the kind of decks where if you take an early like Burst Lightning or Lightning Bolt, then you can kind of just know that you can end up in either of these decks and you'll be pretty happy either way. So the red-white deck, it's one that we kind of panned when we first looked at it because it was like flyers, double strikers, and equipment and pump spells.
It just felt like it was always one removal spell away from just disaster.
It did, and ironically enough, I ended up building my sealed deck as an aggressive red-white deck, which is kind of flies in the face of also the sealed things we talked about.
Yeah, it was kind of a double whammy. You did the cheap aggressive deck and sealed, which we advised against, and also the red-white deck, which you and I, look, I mean, I don't think that either of us were saying that the deck was bad. It was just we were saying this doesn't look like the path that I want to walk down in this format. It looks like, to me, it just looked very fragile. And I don't like playing those decks that, like, if you assemble the exact right combo at the exact right time, can punch through, and really give you a pretty sweet payoff with a huge double striker. For me, I'm like, I'd rather just have more well-rounded, sort of solid double type cards rather than the strikeout home run deck that one seemed to be, though I don't think it actually is.
Right. It has played out better than I thought. I think part of it is that you're not paying all that much to play these cards. Like one of the cards that has really impressed me is Sunspear Shikari, the 1 white for a 2/2 that when it's equipped, it has first strike and lifelink. It is a 2-mana 2/2. If you don't draw equipment, it's not disaster.
No, it's not, especially because you are trying to beat down, and it's part of your curve. It's going to get in for some amount of damage. A 2-mana 2/2 in, well, like the Spirits deck or something like that. If it didn't have any synergies, you'd be pretty sad about it because your deck just often doesn't have that aggressive draw. But with this one, that's what you're trying to do, and you need a 2-drop at some point, and it's got really nice upside too.
Right. If you can equip and get one hit in, you usually feel really good about that.
Yeah, for sure.
Your opponent can rarely block it. You've gained like 4 or 5 life. And for that reason, I actually, that cards like this are generally just not that costly to play. Viashino Slaughtermaster is another one. It's a 1 and a red for a 1/1 double striker, and you can pay a green and a black to give it ++1. But
that's actually never happened. So
yeah, I've never seen that happen. But that one, it's kind of just like playing a 2-mana 2/1, and if you have an equipment, it can just hit for a bunch. So what I would stay away from is cards like Core Duelist, the 1 white 1/1 that has double strike when equipped. I actually don't like that card. I think that card is exactly what this deck doesn't want unless you just have like the nut deck somehow.
Yeah, I mean, that's taking that concept that I just mentioned, that strikeout home run thing, to an extreme.
Right. And
right. And it's actually more like a strikeout double. Right. Like,
yeah, that's the problem is like, it's not even better to hit with Core Duelist than a Sunspear Shikari if you've got like a Darksteel Axe.
Yeah. So, and if you don't have a Darksteel Axe, you'd much rather have the Sunspear Shikari.
Yeah, if it's like a Flare Husk or something.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and the other archetype besides the red-white one is the red-black one, which this one is not heavily themed at all. Yes, it has Bloodthirst. It has a bunch of creatures that if you hit your opponent, they come into play with a 1 or 2 +1/+1 counters on them.
Yeah, but there's only like 4 or 5 in the set, right?
Right, and they don't ask that much of you. Basically, the red-black deck just wants to draft a curve. The red-white deck wants to draft a curve, but is a little more focused on equipment. Both of these decks, I think, are fairly generic in that you can just kind of go into them without committing yourself that much. And, again, I just can't say enough about starting with, Blinding Soul Eater, Arrest, and Sunlance. I actually like starting with white cards more than any other color in this format, since I think it just dips into all the good archetypes. So you can end up in Affinity, you can end up in Spirits, you can end up in red-white. Blinding Soul Eater is even good in red-black because you don't mind paying the 2 life to get your creatures through, and you can end up in some of the decks that we're going to talk about later. So
yeah, I mentioned the pivot card thing. Blinding Soul Eater is one of the top pivot cards in the format, no doubt about it.
Right, I first picked that in my second draft and was very happy over Pelakka Worm, which I like Pelakka Worm, but yeah. So another card which has been very, very good is Glinthawk Idol.
Yes,
you don't need a lot of artifacts for this card to be good. Yes, it's nice to get free activations, but paying a white to make it a 2/2 is still fine. Part of the reason it's so much better here than it might look is Narcolepsy, Arrest are both cards that just try to kill at sorcery speed. Tribal Flames, Spread the Sickness. It just dodges a lot of the removal.
Right, that's totally true. All the sorcery speed stuff, basically.
Right, and for that reason, I think Glinthawk Idol or Darksteel Axe or Cranial Plating are good reasons to like start either in red-white or end up on Affinity. So I think that regardless of where you end up, you're pretty happy starting because these cards are just powerful and they can branch you out. Same with starting with red cards like Burst Lightning, Lightning Bolt, Vishino Slaughtermaster, Blood Ogre, the 2 to red for a 2/2 first strike that has Bloodthirst 1. So these are all, or Gorehorn Minotaurs, the 2 red for a 3/3 Bloodthirst 2. These are all cards where you can kind of go in a couple different directions and you can be pretty happy when you end up. You don't need specific cards. Like these decks are both pretty good if you just get a curve and a couple removal spells.
Yeah.
The red-white deck a little bit more synergistic, but less than I think we both thought on our first look.
Yeah, for sure. And, I'm going to hit this up again, but this is something that I pay a lot of attention to while evaluating archetypes is, well, what removal do we get? And again, does it suit what the deck's trying to do? And it turns out that both of these versions have quite strong removal suites based on the red. You get your uncommon lightning bolts and your common burst lightnings, which are epic in this deck. I mean, they are really, really good. They're super cheap ways to get blockers out of the way, and they're nice top decks later in the game to give you that reach to get in the last few points of damage. And then if you go down the white route, you get Arrest and Oblivion Ring, which are really great because they only cost 3 mana, so they're really adept at keeping the beats flowing. If you go down the black route, you do get a little bit slower tools. You get Spread the Sickness that we talked about before, and you get Grim Affliction, which is good enough to get something out of the way. It's not quite as efficient, but it can do it. And, sometimes you can Grim Affliction and put a counter on your Bloodthirst guy if you're just, completely going off or whatever. But the key is, yes, the removal does match up nicely with what you're trying to accomplish with these decks. And that's just something that's really important. Like if that wasn't the case, we probably wouldn't be talking about this here. It's just, you need to be able to have the tricks in the removal to get the damage through. The deck's pretty straightforward, right? I mean, it's playing creatures, it's attacking with them. In some cases, it's getting some Bloodthirst going. In other cases, you're equipping them to, make your creatures, to abuse Double Strike, basically. But in either case, you need removal and or tricks to keep creatures out of the way from blocking, because if the game goes long enough, they are going to start playing those Pelakka Worms or, even just, 4/4s and 5/5s out of Sunburst or whatever that are just going to outclass your creatures. And I think that either way you go, you're going to have pretty good answers in this deck. And you also do get, of course, the different combat tricks that we mentioned. There was a couple of them that we opened. In our pack here, we opened a Mutagenic Growth, which is a card you can play in the red-white version primarily. A Mighty Leap, another one you can play in that deck, and then the Brute Force, which I think is the best of the three, that gets you in for a ton of damage. as well. Sunlance, there's a whole bunch of other cards. Nameless Inversion we've talked about earlier. These, of course, all suit the deck really well, too. So I think this deck is just like, it's to me, the black version, the red-black version is just one of the most clean, archetypical, aggressive decks. It has all the tools it needs. It gets a bump from Bloodthirst, and it puts together a solid, reliable game plan that can win against basically anybody. And then the red-white version's a little trickier. It basically asks a little bit more of you. It asks that you dedicate some picks to equipment. It asks that you cast and equip those cards, which cost you cards and mana. The payoff for it makes it a little bit higher because if you have enough double strikers, you can end up getting in for huge chunks of damage and keep on presenting really tough, like really potent threats. They're quite easy to deal with, but your opponent's going to run out of removal at some point. If you have critical mass of double strikers, you can just throw all those equipment onto one and keep hitting them. And that is a decent way to go. Like I said, I think that the red-white version tends to be a little bit higher on the risk-reward scale than the black version, but I do think that the power level is also higher on the red-white one, so it's probably where I'd be like if I had to choose between the two, but you can do either.
Yeah, I just would like people to stay away from Core Duelist and Mighty Leap and garbage like that. I think yeah. you don't need to resort to that. I think the deck is perfectly fine without trying to mise that hard.
What about Copper Carapace? Like, what's the equipment that you're looking for here? Darksteel Axe is one for me that comes to mind, and the other one being cranial plating that you mentioned earlier. I think that those really stand out. Is that also just where you want to go, or do you go deeper? Like, are you Flare Husking? Are you Sickle Slicering? Yeah. Are you doing all of those?
I think Cranial Plating is the best one to start with, and Darksteel Axe is also quite good. I think that Slayer Husk and Sickle Slicer and Copper Carapace are all quite playable in the red-white deck. A little less so in the black deck because you don't really want to spend time equipping. You just want to curve out. But in the red-white deck, I mean, you put any of those cards in a Leonin Shikari or a Sunspear Shikari and you're pretty happy.
Okay. Next one. Number 2 on our list is 5-color control / ramp. Whatever you want to call it. This is the multicolored deck, right? It's the deck that wants to cast cards like Rampant Growth and Wayfarer's Bauble in order to usually be green based is the ones that I've seen, the ones that I've played, I should say, have been green at their base. They're usually green red based. Mainly because I take Fiery Fall very highly in this deck, and then the red removal spells that follow it are quite nice. You also get a payoff with Tribal Flames, and then the green is a little more obvious. You get the Rampant Growth itself, and then you get some of the good green ramp cards like Kozilek's Predator and Nest Invader, those type of cards. And you can of course go up to cards like Palaka Worm that just sort of has this plot point laid out for you. But you also get to splash into other colors for powerful cards that you're going to get to play in your deck, as well as abusing Domain and utilizing Sunburst too. This is, you can call it what you want, but this is the multicolored deck. And this was probably the most popular sealed deck that I saw on day one at the Grand Prix, and also a quite viable and very popular draft deck too, which I think is pretty cool.
It's by far the most popular sealed deck because this is actually, I think, the default way to build your sealed deck.
Yeah.
I also, going back to like the theme of how do you end up in these decks, this is the deck you end up in, I think, the most often if you're just drafting normally, and it can support multiple people at a table. Because this deck doesn't really ask anything of you besides having a way to cast expensive spells and having a way to cast a lot of different colors. And there's a lot of redundancy here. Rampant Growth and Wayfarer's Bauble are the best ways to fix your mana and ramp, but then with Kozilek's Predator and Nest Invader also being very good. But you can still play Spirit of the Suns here if you have to, even though I don't really love it. There's also Bounce Lands and Evolving Wilds.
Oh, yeah. That's a great point, especially Evolving Wilds for the Domain and Bounce Lands for the card advantage.
Yeah, so this deck ends up, like you said, base green I think is the only thing that is really consistent between builds. Often red because, again, Fiery Fall's good, Tribal Flames is quite important, and, all the 2-color decks don't want Tribal Flames, so you get this 2-mana deal for kind of late in the pack sometimes. So the advantage of playing this deck is that you get to play everything you open that's good. You open an Elesh Norn Pack 3, probably can play it. You open a card, you can definitely ramp into it and cast it on turn 6. Mm-hmm. You open a Profane Command, you likely can twist your mana. Like, the mana fixing in this format is so good. You can play double black, double white, double green spells in your deck, and it will be fine.
Yes.
The disadvantage is this deck, it doesn't have any particular synergies besides the fact that it's playing, like, Domain cards, cards like Tribal Flames or Mechka Riders. It's a little reliant on opening powerful cards. I think the most lopsided matchups you can see in this entire format is when a good 5-color deck plays against a bad one. Because nobody's winning the game very quickly, so it's just going to come down to who has better cards, and the good one's just going to have better cards.
Yeah, it's funny. It almost feels like when you watch those, or if you're participating in those, that you could almost just turn the decks over and kind of say, yeah, you're probably going to win. Right? Like, it's not, obviously you need to play out the match, and that's not the end of it, but it has more of a feel to that than most matchups I've seen, since coming back to the game, where it's just like, well, I know that you have, an Elish Norn, and you've also got, an Apocalypse Hydra and a Banefire, and I've got like a Savage Twister and a Karn, and it's like, well, how does this match up? Right. Cause like these things are going to show up at some point. Like you said, these decks aren't really capable of coming out to quick starts. Even the fairly quick creature starts with like the Nest Invaders and the Kozilek's Predators get outclassed pretty quickly. And, usually they're good enough at holding down the ground so that you can't win in that way. And so then it does come down to, all right, well, Elish Norn's my big finisher, and that's what won me the game. Or, like I said, like an Apocalypse Hydra or whatever.
Right, because these decks frequently are looking for 2 to 4 high-end threats, like really big threats, and frequently have 6 removal spells. So when 2 match up against each other, it really comes down to which exact cards are there. Whereas a good red-white deck can easily lose to a bad red-white deck if the bad red-white deck just gets a faster draw.
Right.
So, whereas that's not going to happen. So that's one of the disadvantages of being in 5-color. It's actually why I didn't build my sealed deck in this way. I could have built a bad 5-color sealed deck, I think.
But you felt like you just didn't have that ceiling high enough?
I just had no really good high-end cards, and if I played against a good 5-color sealed deck, I could just never win. So, whereas the red-white deck can still go under them. So, one of the reasons I don't like this archetype always is that if you don't open or get past, some powerful cards, then your deck by itself is just kind of mediocre. It's like the average deck of the format. And, most decks are going to have 1 to 2 really, really good cards. And if you just end up with, your finishers are Ulamog's Crusher and you have a Savage Twister, it's like, well, you're just going to lose to the other 5-color decks. That being said, if you open anything good, getting to play it is awesome. The deck is fairly consistent despite being a 5-color deck, just because there's just so much fixing. Like, I rarely have drafted this deck and felt like I was short on fixing. I've cut fixing more often than anything else. Just because you don't want 5, rampant growths. You want 3, because otherwise you'll flood on mana, and you want 3 or 4 bounce lands, but it's not that hard to get those. So that hasn't been the gate for me. The limiting factor is having the really good high end defined.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I've had sort of 3 different versions of this deck. And I shouldn't say versions, I mean levels of this deck, where I've definitely drafted the underpowered version before, where it just didn't have the punch in the top end, and I sorely missed it. I just felt like I just don't have inevitability. I mean, even a card like Selesnya Guildmage or something can be your inevitability. You don't need something, that costs 7 or 8 mana necessarily. But I remember having a deck that I felt like could get to the late game and had good mana. It just didn't do enough. The next tier up from that I've had is one that had certain aspects of really powerful things that you can do with the deck, but not the big punch at the top. Like, it had something like 3 Etched Oracles, basically so that I could just draw my deck at some point, it felt like. But I also didn't have the big, Karn or Elish Norn or Apocalypse Hydra to actually kill my opponent. So even though my deck would do what it wanted to do every game, I just was sort of spinning my wheels, not actually getting there. And I had to try to overwhelm them with just raw card advantage, but the cards themselves weren't that great. And then in the last case, I have had a really good version of the deck that had the fixing and had the punch. And maybe it was lacking a little bit on that middle ground, drawing cards, the Mole Drifters and the Etched Oracles and stuff, but it didn't matter. I found that if you do have that top end punch, that's kind of all that matters at some point, and you can lean on that pretty hard, because the bombs in this format are off the charts. I mean, there's some just completely unreasonable magic cards in here, because they're supposed to be getting brought back or, being cast off of, Tron lands in Modern or whatever. And instead you're just like, here's Kozilek, right? Like, I can actually cast this card, and all of a sudden, you can dominate a game with that, or an Ulamog, or, like I mentioned, the Elish Norns and Karns of the world or whatever.
Yeah. When I drafted this deck in, the first draft in the Grand Prix, I opened Hellkite Charger, then Comet Storm, then Ant Queen. So my high end was pretty good.
So you did it.
I did lose a game where I cast all 3 of those cards, which I thought was basically impossible.
Wow, that is crazy. So one of the card types that really stands out to me for this deck, Luis, are sweepers, right? Ways to deal with the board in a broad way, not just spot removal spells, but ways that you like. Because the way that this often plays out, right, is that in the early stages of the game, you're ramping up your mana. You're playing your rampant growths and that kind of thing. Maybe you're getting your bounce lands going or whatever, and even though those work and you get up to 5 or 6 mana with a bunch of different colors fairly quickly, it does put a lot of heat on your deck to do something very relevant right away. And if that thing is just like, let's say that your big payoff in this case is a Skyreach Manta. You make a 5/5 flyer, on turn 6 or turn 5 or whatever. Like, that's pretty great, right? I mean, that is definitely a nice payoff. But one of the decks we just talked about, in fact, the one directly previous, was a red base aggressive deck. And if you spend the first 2 to 3 turns bounce landing and fixing your mana, and then your payoff is a 5/5 flyer, that deck will chew you up. Like you will die to that deck pretty easily. If they're playing blue, they'll Aether Snipe it and hit you or whatever. And you definitely feel a little vulnerable to a bunch of small creatures. So what I've seen is that, card like Savage Twister, right? Like that thing is just the nuts in this deck, right? Like you want to get those. That's the highest priority. That's often a card that puts you into this deck because you don't have to play that thing for 8, right? To make it good. You can play it for, X equals 2 or X equals 3 and completely wipe away the board from your opponent. And in many ways, the game just ends right there. Like, cause your stuff is so much better in the late game than what like a red-white deck can do, that killing 2 or 3 of their creatures with a Savage Twister often just ends the game on the spot.
Right. Savage Twister is one of the reasons to get into this deck. Getting like a 3rd pick Savage Twister pack 1 is like, well, the 5-color control deck is looking pretty good. All Those Dust is another really, really good sweeper in the deck. That's a rare, but there are no decks better than the decks that have like good sweepers, good high end, and good ramp. It's just, those decks are just so awesome. It's hard to get every single part of that, but every now and then you get to have a sample of them. And Savage Twister is one of the reasons to get into this deck. Another big reason to get into this deck is that you can just start by taking cards that are good, and if you never find an archetype to really like sink your teeth into, you can generally build this deck. You don't have to be in there from the beginning.
Yeah, I think that this is, it speaks to my draft style, and also it may be a flaw of mine in this format, which is that I do end up in this deck, a bigger percentage than any other deck. And that is because I try to stay open in a lot of ways, and I am kind of concentrating on these pivot cards. Like, I'm just not the type of person to commit on my very first pick to something like a cranial plating and try to be an affinity deck or, something along those lines. It goes against the way that I think that you should draft. So I tend to avoid it for that reason, but also it's so high risk because the decks tend to be so delineated in this format that if you do find yourself fighting with somebody for it, you could just end up with a very bad deck. And you really want to find your lane, is, kind of how we've been putting it, is you want to know what deck you're supposed to be drafting. And it's basically what the other people aren't. But this one, there's enough fixing going around to support multiple 5-color drafters in the set. And that's pretty insane. That isn't the norm. Usually it's like, we would have people scrambling for these rampant growths, but it turns out when there's a colorless rampant growth, there's also Sphere of the Suns and actual rampant growth. You can do it. You can certainly draft this. I've had multiple times where I have played the mirror that we described earlier because somebody else was in this deck too. And, I gotta say this to me, this is my second favorite deck to draft in the format, but it's the most fun. For me, it feels a little bit like Cube, where you're like figuring out how your deck's going to play each game. Okay, I need to get this color. You need to know all the cards in your deck because if you search up the wrong color for your rampant growth, then it can really sting you. It really challenges you to kind of set up everything right because the payoffs are there, but if you stumble your way through getting those payoffs set up, you can often find yourself dead or the payoff's too late or you didn't, plan things out correctly. And you get access to all types of spells too, which I really like. I mean, sometimes you'll just play like a Gnarlid pack in your deck. So you're playing just 2/2 for 2 that has some upside later in the game, all the way up to the big stuff like Palaka Worms and all the removal. You get to play the lightning bolts and the arrests and spread the sicknesses and all that kind of stuff. And it's really fun to kind of discover how your deck feels like winning each game. And of course, sometimes you don't. don't. But, I find that journey really fun. It tends to not get that old for me, cause I just genuinely don't know when I sit down exactly how my deck's going to play out. And, examining my opening 7, I'm always just like, well, let's see what this game wants to do. And I find a lot of joy in that.
Right. This this deck is, I don't think it's actually even that much on you that you end up in this the most. This is, I think, the most common draft archetype, just because it's found in multiple times per table. You could, I think, easily support 3 on a table, which means that you are more likely to draft this than any other individual deck.
Good. And, that makes me feel a little better that I wasn't just defaulting to it out of like fear of commitment or something.
No. And I do think that this deck kind of embodies the Modern Masters experience to some degree. Just you're playing a bunch of sweet cards, and I think that is pretty fun.
Yeah. Also Mole Drifter. Number 1.
So number 1, again, is kind of 2 decks, but I feel like they're so close together that we could just call them one. And I do think that this is just the best deck to be in because it's got the perfect combination of, great linear power when you get all the cards, and you don't really have to commit that much to get into the deck, and a lot of the pieces are replaceable. So number 1, I think, is the green-based tokens deck. It's either green-white or black-white or some combination of all 3 that involves green. And this deck is really just looking to combine cards like Scatter the Seeds and Raise the Alarm and Nestimator and Kozilek's Predator with cards that reward you for them. And one of the reasons it's so strong is that there's just a lot of cards that reward you and a lot of ways to make tokens. And I think that's just an awesome place to be.
It's funny. This was one of the really cool things about a new draft format, and it happened to sort of be expressed at the GP in Las Vegas, is that people will discover the good cards and the good synergies of a new deck. And sometimes that happens while at a tournament. And it actually kind of felt like that happened at GP Las Vegas. I mean, I think that, we talked about this deck being a thing in our set primer. It's not like it was a mystery that it existed, but how to build it and how good it was a mystery. And it started to come into focus while we were actually there. And I remember I actually had a chat with Nate Holt, who works on Walking the Plains. You've probably seen him on the videos as the wizard and the host of Walking the Plains. Now, Nate's not a hardcore drafter. He's becoming more, but when he first started coming to the coverage stuff and doing drafts with us, he was still, learning and that kind of thing. But he's been doing some Modern Masters, and he sat me down and he said, I want to tell you the deck that I like the best is this green-white tokens deck. He goes, I really think it's just the best. And I'm like, well, tell me about it. And, cause I'm always one to listen to an opinion and hear somebody's perspective on it, especially because I hadn't drafted it. And he kind of went into it, not super in depth, but he was like, this is what you want to do. And he just felt, he said he felt bulletproof because people would play some huge spell, again, going back to like the Skyreach Manta payoff or whatever. And he's just like, I don't care. And just attack with everything. And then you just randomly get these absurd cards like, like an Overwhelming Stampede or something like that, which, can be quite good in the deck. But even more to the point, a Sigil Blessing or Selesnya Guildmage, which we talked about a little bit earlier. Even just Overwhelm can be very good in this deck. And you can just kill people that he said it felt like to him that it was fighting on a different axis than the rest of the decks, which were a little more focused on making, vertical threats, if you will, right? Like piling a bunch of equipment on one thing or casting a huge monster or whatever. And, I got to say that after he told me that, it certainly came true. I watched it on camera while a lot of the pros, I'm curious to hear from you, Luis, how this came to you. Did you discover this on your own, or did you, kind of have a powwow with the professionals? Because it really seemed to come, like I said, into focus late in the day, like in the second draft at the GP.
So the way I got into this deck actually it's kind of funny. It has to do with the time zone changes, where GP Utrecht was the same format and like 9 hours ahead of us.
Yeah.
And Martin Juza and Lucas Blohan, two pros from the Czech Republic. Martin may be one of the best limited players. Martin messaged me. He's like, "You have to draft this deck. This deck is just the best deck." And he kind of sent me a draft primer on Facebook.
Really? That's crazy.
So I woke up on Sunday morning and he had just sent me a bunch of stuff about and pictures of his deck from the GP. So he's like, "Look, I think Sign of the Wild is very undervalued. That's a 1 green, a creature that's as big as the number of creatures you have, which used to be a rare and now is a common." He says Scatter the Seeds is just awesome. There's just a lot of ways to make this token deck work. And I get to the GP, and my first draft, I drafted the 5-color deck because it was just open. I opened a great rare, got past, some removal, whatever. My second draft, I started with Blinding Soul Eater, and then pretty quickly went into green-white and ended up with 6 Scatter the Seeds.
6 Scatter the Seeds.
I could have had 7. I actually took Fortify number 2 over Scatter the Seeds number 7.
Wow.
And my deck was just incredible. I ended up with 3 Raise the Alarm, 6 Scatter the Seeds, 2 Rootkin Ally, Conclave Phalanx, 2 Fortifies, 3 Sunlances, which I even cut 2 of them because my deck had too many good cards.
That's unbelievable.
And I went 3-0, and yeah, the deck was just great. So it is kind of funny that the deck came around that way. I think it's not that the deck wasn't obvious because it has all these cards in it. Like you read the card Scatter the Seeds or Fortify and you kind of get what's going on. I think it's just how good it was. It wasn't clear to me, at least.
It wasn't. I don't think it was clear to most. And we started seeing it show up on camera, and you had it in your hands. And I mean, there was rumors flying around the building that you did you cast some inordinate number of Scatter the Seeds in one turn or something?
In my first feature match, so for the draft, I guess, I went turn 1 Tuka-Tung Thallid, turn 2 Rune Servitor, turn 3 Tuka-Tung Thallid go, end of turn Scatter the Seeds, turn 4 Scatter the Seeds, Scatter the Seeds, Scatter the Seeds. So
I was not in the booth for that one.
I scattered 12 seeds by turn 4, and then I didn't even actually have to play a Fortify or anything. I just attacked my opponent to death because I had, a million creatures.
Wow, that is sick. And is that so? That's obviously an exceptional draw, but ratchet it down to us on what you would expect from a normal draw. How does it play out? Like you said, you played Tuka-Tung Thallid. Now this is in the deck that you just told me you cut Sunlances out of. So I need to get a little more depth on this thing. Well,
Tuka-Tung Thallid's 1 green for a 1/1, and when it dies, you get a 1/1 Sapperling. Mm-hmm. So I just played it over Sunlance because of the raw power level of the card.
Yeah, right. This is why I need to know what the hell's going on, because Tuka-Tung Thallid's a pretty low impact card, and I need to know why it makes the cut over Sunlance, for example.
Well, this deck specifically, again, it had 6 Scatters and 2 Rootkin Allies and a Conclave Phalanx, so it had every card that cost more than 3 mana had Convoke, so Tuka-Tung Thallid kind of just taps for green mana. So that's why it actually made the cut. I would have played more. I had 3 in my deck, and I would have played a 4th.
Okay.
But so in general, how this deck wants to look is the highest priority that I found is Scatter the Seeds and Raise the Alarm and Kozilek's Predator and Nest Invader. So those are the 4 main commons that make tokens. And then you have the payoff cards, which are Sign of the Wild, Fortify, Overwhelm, Rootkin Ally, Conclave Phalanx, and then cards like Bone Splinters, and a Scavenger Drake and Algae Gariel. Which I don't know if you like the Gariel, but
we're going to talk about that in a minute, buddy. You just leave the truths to me.
So basically, you're trying to have this mix of cards that make tokens and cards that pay you for tokens, and then removal spells, with the last kind of part of the deck being just cheap creatures that don't do anything because of all the Convoke cards. And Tuka-Tung Thallid is good with cards like Bone Splinters anyway.
Okay, yeah, that deck seems great. How does it play out normally?
There are kind of 2 ways it can play out. One is that if you just have enough token makers, you can just run over your opponent with token makers. You can just go play a bunch of creatures, cast Arrest or Sunlance or Bone Splinters on your biggest creature, attack you with everything. And sometimes that'll actually just do the trick. If you get 7 creatures out, you're often... One of the things you have to be aware of with this deck is when you want to throw away a creature to deal damage, because it often comes up where you want to all right, I'm going to make this attack. I'm going to lose 2 1/1s. My opponent's going to take 7. And then you have to look at the next turn. All right, I'm going to lose 2 1/1s. My opponent's going to take 5 if they don't play anything, and that'll be enough. And then you just hope that if they play a creature, you draw a removal spell or another creature. And you have to know when you need to just attack with everything or not. Because this is the deck that most frequently makes attacks where you lose creatures and your opponent doesn't, just to get damage through.
I see. But that's the whole point, right? Is that you get to go wider than your opponent and get in that damage. And then at the same time, if they don't do anything, you're still putting out power and toughness. Now, there's these augmenting cards, too. You mentioned Fortify a couple of times, so that you can use that to give all of your creatures +2/+0 until end of turn. There's also Overwhelm, which is somewhat ironically named because the 2 times when it's been printed, which was M15 and here, since I've been playing again, it's been quite underwhelming. But is it good here? Is it good in this deck? Is that what you want?
Fortify, I think, is generally safer because Fortify, you can just cast it for 3 mana and all your tokens deal an extra 2, and that's just good. You're happy to play that. Overwhelm is better in the really, really good token decks. But in general, I mean, they're both just ways to finish the game when you have a bunch of tokens. So that's another way that happens. You just cast Fortify or Overwhelm and your opponent just dies. Or you cast a Sign of the Wild or a Root Canal and you just attack your opponent with 10/10s. So that's like another way to, that doesn't go quite as wide, but it's still, you could just play a 3-mana 7/7 or essentially like a 2-mana like 9/9 with a Root Canal, which you can convoke out.
That's pretty sweet. Yeah, I've seen that. I've seen that deck do that. You know, the Root Canal is the one that you can, tap 2 of your creatures to give it +2/+2 until end of turn. Is that right, Luis?
It's 4 green for a 3/3, but it has Convoke, and you can tap 2 creatures to give it +2/+2.
Yeah, so, okay. That's the main part that I was saying. And so, but what I've seen, from those 2 cards is that it throws such a different curveball at the opponent who's really trying to adjust to your deck. Oftentimes they'll see that you're playing a couple of Scatter the Seeds and a Raise the Alarm. And so they'll be like, all right, I'm going to go to sideboards. I'll take out a couple of my, more expensive sort of tall threats, and I'll put in like a Rune Servitor or a Gnarlid Pack or something that just interacts better with 1/1s and gets down on the board sooner. And then you play a stupid Rootkin ally or a Scion of the Wild, and it's a 7/7, and they're sitting there staring at their dumb Gnarlid Pack that can't hang anymore. It's pretty funny how you can hit from 2 different angles with this tokens deck. I think that's pretty important.
And one of the strengths of this deck is that you can start into this deck by drafting cards like Sunlance, Arrest, Nameless Inversion, Grim Affliction, Spread the Sickness, just the good removal spells. Blinding Soul Eater makes another appearance here. And you're not committing to anything. And then you get a Scatter the Seeds 5th pick, and you're just like, all right, tokens is open. And you just take a bunch of the token-making cards and the payoffs that frequently no one else wants, and your deck just has a bunch of different good nut draws that, will beat most normal draws. It has a really high end while still being pretty consistent. It's just when you have a deck that has just removal and a good curve and these token making payoffs, then you can usually get it to the point where you don't often fizzle just because your cards all do something.
Yeah. A similar cousin of this deck is the green-black version, right? Which can run many of the same cards to strong effect, but gives you a little bit of a different look. Basically it lets you get Bone Splinters, which is a pretty big game, right? Bone Splinters, of course, is black sorcery, sacrifice a creature, destroy target creature. And, from what Luis has described here, you clearly have expendable creatures all over the place, right? And so now you're really trying to leverage that and make your Bone Splinters that much better. Is there a big pull? What are you giving up by going into black here?
So the black version of the deck is much less aggressive and swarmy because you don't have Fortify and you don't have Raise the Alarm. So you're a little bit less make a bunch of tokens, attack, pump them all. You can still play Overwhelm. You can still play a lot of the same cards like Sign of the Wild or Rootkin Ally, but you just have more removal. Instead of Sunlance, Arrest, and Blinding Soul Eater, you have Bone Splinters, Grim Affliction, Nameless Inversion, Spread the Sickness, and because of that, you tend to rely more on cards like Algae Gerial or Scavenger Drake or the Reassembling Skeleton plus Bloodthorn Vampire combination. Bloodthorn Vampire is another reason that you kind of end up in green-black. And so you're more often trying to build one big threat while killing your opponent's creatures and taking control a little bit, grinding your opponent out, than you are trying to swarm them. But the reason I love these 2 archetypes is they blend into each other a lot. They have generically powerful draws. They have good removal, and they can sometimes just win by casting 2 Scatter the Seeds. You don't have to do anything.
Yeah, that deck is super powerful from what I've seen. So the card that I wanted to talk about, I'm really excited to talk about, is Algae Gerial. It's the truth. Ben Stark. Gerial. No, I don't trust you. You don't know. I say Algae Gerial, but I don't actually call it that anymore. Because, Ben Stark, he had a really good day 1 at the GP, and he had 2 of those in his deck, and he came back and we were talking about it, and I had told him that I had played one myself, and I said, that card's just great. It really seems like it's overperforming. And I remember when it was in Shards Block or whatever, and it was just okay. It was a card you could play and it was fine, but it just felt like it was doing really good work. And he's like, that card's incredible. Now, Ben's a little prone to hyperbole. So you sometimes have to put a filter on it. I'm like, well,
I don't believe you.
Is he just saying that, or does he really mean it? But I kind of, prodded a little and was like, well, like, is it just overperforming or is it like really that good? And he's like, that card's just the truth. And I'm like, it is the truth. Cause I had this feeling in the back of my head that the card was really great, but my sample size was small. I'd played it in like a draft or two, and it wasn't like a thing where I just was willing to just, proclaim to the world that this card was a second coming or something. But, now that Ben was doing it, I was more than happy to jump on board. And I've played it since a couple of times, and he has as well. And the card is legit. It is, so the main things to keep your eye on when it comes to this card, to Algae Garel. So of course it's, by the way, it's a 1/1 for 4, 3 and a green with Shroud. And whenever
it
another
passes the vanilla test.
it's swimming in the muck when it comes to the vanilla test. But it says whenever another creature dies, you can put a +1/+1 counter on it. And again, that just isn't really that powerful. It's a little slow. You and I, Luis, and especially Ben, we all value things that impact the board immediately when they come down. So the fact that like I'm so high on this card, it really speaks volumes about how good it is, because this is the type of card I generally don't like, where it's like, yeah, okay, I play it. It basically does nothing for a few turns. Then if I have a creature and it trades, it gets a couple of counters. And I'm like, yeah, I don't really like that. Here, it's just a different world. You get to play it with Eldrazi spawn tokens. And that means that you can sack those anytime you want to just put a +1/+1 counter on the Gharial. Okay, that's great. What would be the normal weaknesses to a card like this? Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me, because they've been pushing it so hard in recent sets, are small death touch creatures, right? Your Hand of Silumgars, your Typhoid Rats, those type of things. There aren't any. There's just no death touch in the whole set. It's just not there. The Algae Gharial just never runs into some annoying small thing that just kills it. It just doesn't exist. The thing just gets to run rampant on your opponent. On top of it, if you trade off any creatures, it grows, right? And remember, it gets one for each creature that dies, no matter whose it was. And that adds up shockingly fast. It adds up so quickly, especially if you have removal. Right now, you attack with the thing. It's a 3/3 or whatever. You've got an Eldrazi spawn token sitting there, plus 5 mana or whatever, and a few cards in hand, and your opponent's just like, what the hell am I supposed to do with this dumb thing? Like, if I block it, they're going to grow it bigger than whatever I'm blocking it with. I'm taking on this huge risk. And if I don't, well, they might just still make the same play. Like, okay, you don't block, I'll sack my token, I'll kill your guy, take 6, right? It's like, oh my God. And this thing can get absolutely huge if you combine it with like Savage Twister or anything along those lines, where you're killing 3, 4, maybe 5 creatures at once because you're killing both sides of the board. And then it leaves you with like an 8/8 Algae Gharial and you just kill them with it. I did a stream last night here from the hotel. I was kind of shocked, honestly, Luis, that the stream worked at all, just because I was on my small laptop. I've got an 11-inch MacBook Air. I'm on hotel internet, and it actually worked out fine. But, I was joking around the whole time about the truth, and I have a card with it in my hand, in fact, right now, that is a foil Algae Gharial that I specifically acquired to write the word truth on the front of, and did. And I was flashing it to the camera, and we were having a lot of fun. But I have to say, the card completely over-delivered in the deck that I drafted, and I think it's one of the most underrated cards in the set, not close. And the cool part is, it goes in the deck that you just talked about. The green-white version even can totally play this card, and your Tukatung Thalids and that kind of thing can get some good value. Culling Deus or Culling Dias or Culling Days or however the hell you say it, that card can do good work in this. Your Bone Splinters. Again, all of these work well with the Algae Gharial. I'm a huge fan of the truth.
Is that all you had to say about it?
That was it.
Oh, okay.
That was my, I will kindly step down from my soapbox about this card. It skyrocketed to the top for me. It's one of my favorites now.
No, completely understandable. I think the card is awesome.
All right. So you think, though, like, let's just take a quick look back before we sign off for the night. You think this green-white token stack, maybe if there's a little bit of black or, whatever, is actually the best deck in the format?
I do. I think, draft is self-correcting at any point when,
yes.
If this gets overdrafted and there are 2 people trying to draft at every table, or 3, then that will change how good it is. And in all cases, you should try to figure out what is open. But I think the main reason, if you look at the order in which we had deck, we had the green-white deck or green-black deck, followed by 5-color deck, followed by the red-based decks, followed by Affinity, followed by Spirits, is that you can get into the top 3 decks pretty easily without risking stuff. Yeah. Without risking your draft.
Yeah, I noticed that too, yeah.
Whereas the 4th and 5th and some of the decks we didn't mention as being good are decks that, yes, they're all perfectly draftable and you can get great versions of them, but I feel like it's harder to end up in those decks. And one of the reasons I just love this green deck is that I think it's easy to end up in the deck. It's easy to get a good version, and the deck is, when it is a good version, is very good.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. There's a lot of like sliders that we need to adjust for each deck as far as what's the peak power level of it, how consistent is it when you have it, how easily can you get into it from cards that can go into other, these pivot cards I've been talking about. How much are you going to be fighting for other people for cards that are key to the archetype? Scatter the Seeds is a perfectly playable card in any green deck, but really it usually ends up falling below other cards for most decks outside of this one. So you end up getting those. And the Raise the Alarm is similar. You can play it in a white deck if you want, but there's no, there isn't a white deck that wants it outside of this specifically. So I think that this one does hit the averages on the best, and it's very powerful. That's of course a given here, given that it's number one, but the card, this deck, it can get wins where it doesn't look like it should, and it certainly is capable of beating some of the more strong strategies out there too. Just don't run into a shrivel.
Yeah, I drafted, or I have counter drafted a lot of shrivels and wrapping flames, and don't get me wrong, hate drafting is generally a bad idea. But if there's nothing for you in the pack, these are the cards you should be taking.
Because they do completely blow you out, yeah.
Shrivel especially is just such a beating.
Yeah, it is.
So after green-white, I do like, the 5-color ramp decks. So this is kind of the safest deck. It's funny because this looks like one of the more far out there decks, but I think this is kind of the default deck of the format where if you end up with just good fixing and good cards, you're kind of in this deck. This is the kind of deck that you want to end up in often when you open like a Karn or an Elish Norn or a Comet Storm. Comet Storm is like at its best in this deck just because you can just ramp it up and cast it for a bunch.
Yeah, totally.
This is the deck that makes use of bombs the best, I think.
Yeah, the two decks I like to play the best are the 5-color one, and then I actually really like this green-black sacrifice deck, the one with the truth in it, but also for all the other value reasons. I actually ran, I can't believe we're referencing this card in two completely different decks, but again, Tukatung Thalid, I ran 3 of them in the deck, right? Because again, it keeps you alive. It puts counters on the truth. It gets sacked to Culling Days and does it. It's a good thing for Bone Splinters. Like, it's weird how well that card slots into different decks, even though it's ultimately quite a low power level card.
Definitely. The next pair of decks would be kind of like the red, white, and red, black decks, where if you just draft generically aggressive cards, you can end up in either deck, the red, white deck being a little bit more synergistic. But again, these are decks that are easy to end up in, and you don't risk much by taking the cards like Burst Lightning or Blinding Solar or Arrest early. And then the idea is that you identify around pick 5 or so what key cards for different archetypes are getting passed to you, and then kind of try to go down that direction.
Right.
And then the last two would be Affinity and Black-White Spirits, which are both very linear, have definitely a high end, but not a really easy deck, or not a really easy decks to get into early because you just don't want to take one of the really linear cards early. I don't think that's the way to approach this format.
No, and those are the ones that have the highest. Those two decks, in my mind, have the highest ceiling for the true synergy decks in this format. Those are the ones that give you the best payoff if you end up in the lane that is those and nobody else is in it, or nobody's taking your stuff. Those are the ones that pay you off the most because, like you said, they can do, at least from limited perspective, they can do pretty broken things, both of those decks.
And I just want to touch quickly on the decks we didn't mention.
Sure.
One is the Blue-Red Elementals deck. And this deck, again, has a very high end. If you end up with 2 or 3 Smoke Raiders, I think the deck is quite good. Mm-hmm. That's the 1 in a red for a 1/1 that taps for 2 mana of any color to cast or activate elementals.
Yeah, you can just bury your opponent.
The problem that I have with this deck is that if you end up with 0 to 1 Smoke Raiders or your Smoke Raider just dies, the deck is just so bad. All your cards are just worse than all your opponent's cards. So
yep, they're not efficient. Yeah, you're right.
I don't like drafting this deck. I will draft it if I get past a bunch of late Smoke Raiders in pack 1 and I already had maybe some cards of red or blue. But for the most part, I don't love this deck. I don't see a particular reason to end up there most of the time.
Also, kill the Smoke Raider if you see it.
If your opponent plays a turn 2 Smoke Raider, you should kill it. If you can.
I do. I found myself playing against this deck, and in one game I had a Dismember in my hand, and my opponent did play the Smoke Raider, and I killed it. Which that Dismember's premium removal, and I don't use it lightly. For example, in a different game, my opponent played a threat with a Smoke Raider, which I killed. I drew Dismember later, and then I didn't kill the Smoke Raider because I thought, well, hopefully they're out of threats. Yeah, but given the opportunity to take out the Smoke Braider before the onslaught of whatever was in my opponent's hand. Also, there's other factors here. Like sometimes people keep 2-land Smoke Braider and, plan on playing a 4-drop or a 3-drop the next turn. And if they miss their land, you can just get them. So there's other random upside that you can get. But I used a Dismember on a Smoke Braider on turn 2. It's like, the card's scary. It can lead to those games where you just get completely trounced because they have something that says it taps for 2 mana as a ramp spell. And that's just busted if they have this stuff to back it up.
Definitely. The other 2 decks that I don't really like or draft very often. The blue-black proliferate deck I don't think is like a real thing.
It's just not. I think the power level is just not there for that deck. I tried it once myself, and I think I fell for the same trap that many people did, which is that the deck looks good on paper but just doesn't play well. It just doesn't end up keeping up with what your opponent's doing. I
think there's no reason to draft the blue-black control deck if you could just draft a 5-color deck or a 4-color deck or, some of the multicolor ramp decks.
That's a really good point.
I think they just do a better job of that. And lastly, there's blue-green graft, which, yes, if you can turn 2 Thrumming Bird, turn 3 graft creature them, that's great. But for the most part, I don't think this deck is good. I just think that the power level of your cards are too low and your good draws are just not good enough.
No, I mentioned this on the show too. This is a deck that I drafted in my second draft ever of the format. And while I did do some broken things, I hit with a Thrumming Bird and put 8 counters across my creatures, which is just stupid, right? I mean, that's just off the charts. I think that the fundamental flaw when looking at this deck is saying, well, okay, fine. So my argument was, well, what if they kill your Thrumming Bird, which I think is correct to do. So they're like, okay, Sunlance your Thrumming Bird. Well, the argument that I heard back was, well, you still get to play these decent creatures, like you're playing like 2/2s for 2 and 3/3s for 3, like a Spider and a Plaxcaster Frogling or whatever. And my response was, well, those aren't decent in this format. They're okay. I mean, look, I'm not saying that those are bad cards by any stretch, but that can't be what your deck does. You can't make a 2/2 for 2 and a 3/3 for 3 and expect to win in this format. People are doing, ranging from just outwardly powerful things like the 5-color deck that we've talked about to highly synergistic stuff that goes way beyond, vanilla test passing creatures. We're talking about busted, like how much is, how is a 4/4 for 0 on the vanilla test, right? It's like, there's these synergies.
I don't think it actually works. I think it's a divide by 0 question.
Well, I'm not a mathematician, but I'm gonna assume that it's good. And we talked about nameless inversion. You get it back when your other creature trades. It's like that kind of stuff is just too hard to outpace if you're trying to do this blue-green thing. And ultimately, I just think it's too fragile. Like the problem is that you need to set this thing up with a Thrumming Bird or a Proliferate card, and it ends up being too difficult to do because you can't trade your creatures. Like I found myself in a situation pretty often with that deck where somebody's attacking me and would be a perfectly reasonable trade, but I'm looking at my hand and I'm like, well, I'm going to try to, like, if I lose my Plaxcaster Frogling here, even if it's trading for something decent, like a Cathodian or whatever, like now my Thrumming Bird is garbage, right? Like I'm going to play it and my opponent's going to be like, sure, hit me with your stupid 1/1 flyer for 2. It doesn't do anything. I need to have critical mass of these things. So anyway, I agree. I think that the deck is a little bit too fragile. Even if sometimes it does come together and it looks pretty impressive, it's a bit of a trap.
Right. I think it's the inverse of the green tokens decks where it's linear, but also not powerful.
Right.
Which is not a great place to be in.
And those token decks are a lot more robust. They just don't care as much about what the other cards are doing as long as they're creatures on the battlefield, basically. All right. Is that going to do it? Any more you wanted to say?
No, I think we covered the draft format. If now everyone knows everything they need to know.
That's it. Yeah. Format's been pretty fun. Somebody asked me on Twitter if I thought, or on the stream, if I thought that this was better than original Modern Masters, and my answer was pretty unequivocally no. I think the first one's much better than this set. I had a lot more fun with it. I found that the overlaps were much more plentiful in the first one. That being said, I'm going to draft this set after we get done with the podcast, and I'm pretty excited about it. I think it's really cool. I've been enjoying it. I think that I'll draft it again if it comes out. Like, I think it's real, anytime that they throw together a bunch of really old cards like this and make a bunch of cool archetypes, I'm going to have fun drafting it. It doesn't mean, like, I feel like the original Modern Masters set the bar very, very high. And just because this one didn't live up doesn't make me think that it's bad. I think it's actually quite good.
Agreed.
All right. So that's going to do it for this week. This show, of course, is brought to you by channelfireball.com every single week. Make sure you check out their website for a bunch of awesome free content. I mean, Luis, you were talking about what videos you were going to record. I do draft videos over there. A bunch of the top pros from both the Pantheon and Team Channel Fireball will do videos, articles teaching you how to build your decks. They'll do draft videos if you want to get better at Limited, if you're a constructed player as well. You can find constructed resources on there. You can also find people showing you sideboard guides and, deck text basically to show you how to build decks. It's all there as well as a full selection of singles, sealed product, supplies, shirts, whatever it is that you want to get, memorabilia, that kind of stuff. You can find it at channelfireball.com. All right, that's going to do it for this week. If you want to find Luis on Twitter, his name is, it's super lucky, LSV. God, you're such a sack getting just a 3-letter Twitter name. Mine is Marshall_LR. I went deep. It used to be longer. Way back in the day, it used to be Marshall LR Cast, which had 3 L's in a row, which didn't look quite right. But now it's a little simpler to see. And of course, you can send us an email if you want to do something a little longer, lr@lrcast.com. And yeah, like I said before, check out the Patreon. It's a fun way to give back to the show. You get a thank you card that Inkwell Luder made, and you get some cool bonuses. For example, at one of the tiers, you get to listen to the show unedited. Now, I don't edit the inside of the show much, just a little bit if something gets screwed up, but nothing bad. But, Luis and I will frequently chatter before and after the show where he teases me relentlessly and I get to make fun of him occasionally.
Actually,
too.
If you believe it, it's the other way around.
Well, only certain people know for sure. But yeah, check out patreon.com/limited resources for that. And that's going to do it for this week. So from Las Vegas and Colorado, respectively, we're signing off. We'll see you guys next time.
I'm going to keep sign off pretty short and to the point here. I think that the events of the last couple days after the GP were not the most empathy filled, starting with, of course, the pick of Foil Tarmogoyf over Burst Lightning. Since basically what happened after Pascal Maynard took Foil Tarmogoyf over Burst Lightning is a lot of Magic pros responded somewhat negatively. They did not like the pick because, from looking at it, they thought it was kind of an indictment of like wanting to win the tournament and the being a professional Magic player. And I understand where that's coming from, but I don't think that they went about that in a very constructive way. And then on the flip side, I think people had a backlash against them in the opposite direction, which is also not particularly heartwarming either. Basically, I mean, I responded when this happened that I would not have taken the Goyf. I would take the Burst Lightning. I value winning the tournament really high. But I also don't think that, I think you should put yourself in the other person's shoes, which I feel like no sides of this did that. Basically, everybody was pretty quick to say what they thought, and not always in a good way, and not always in a way that really reflects on kind of like what the other people's experiences might be. I think both, we had, some of the guys like Owen or Huey or Reed saying, expressing great displeasure with this, and then people expressing great displeasure with their displeasure. And the whole thing is very tiring. I don't want to talk a whole lot about it. I'm just saying, I think that everyone could use just, again, a bit of time to think about where other people are coming from and why they might say the things they're saying, even if they weren't said well. So that's all I got to say about that. I hope not to dominate the discussion of this show with that. So if you want to discuss the show, I really hope we talk about the content, but I did want to weigh in just a little bit about that.